Hello and welcome. You're watching Nothing But the Truth. For a decade, my guest gave many interviews on the economy, and during the UPA years, his opinion was much sought after. That was when he was Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. But since then, he's deliberately kept quiet and he's consciously kept his counsel to himself. But today, after 21 months, he's prepared to break that silence and speak about Arun Jaitley's budget as well as the state of the economy. I am, of course, referring to Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, let me start by asking you your overall impression of the budget before I come to specifics and then broaden out and talk about the economy as a whole. Now, this budget put a lot of stress on Manrega, Aadhaar, DBT, farmers, rural India. And to many it seemed the Modi government's focus was moving away from the middle and industrial classes and investors to the poor and Aam Aadmi. In that sense, was this more of a Congress than a BJP budget?
Well, that's a sort of trying to put it in a potentially controversial way. Let me just say, as far as the budget is concerned, one good thing which I think the finance minister got absolutely right was not to accept the advice to break away from the fiscal deficit targets. I mean, he had set it himself and had modified it, and I think it would have been very unfortunate if he had broken from that, so that's good. As far as these schemes are concerned, you know, in our system, I mean, most governments inherit a lot of schemes, and they change them here and there. So the fact that the focus is on Manrega and other schemes of that kind, I don't think represents very much other than a recognition that the agricultural sector did need a lot of attention. I mean, you know, we've had 2 years of very poor agricultural growth. So it makes sense to me to focus on things like Manrega, which is essentially mitigating the impact of drought, and also trying to increase expenditure on education.
You particularly mentioned the fact that the finance minister had stuck to the 3.5% fiscal deficit target for next year. Now, he's done it on the basis that he can sell spectrum up to 99,000 crore, which is 76% more than last year. He's done it on the basis that he can earn from disinvestment 56,000 crore, which is 30,000 plus more than next year. Are those two conditions meetable, or do you think 3.5% is not going to happen?
Well, you know, that kind of question can always be raised with any budget, in the sense that some of the revenue targets you have may not be met, some of the expenditure targets you have may be exceeded. So I think what this means is he's recognized the importance of the fiscal deficit, and if he doesn't get the resources needed, he's going to do something about it. Either mobilize some other resources or cut some other expenditures.
But the commitment to 3.5 in your eyes is the important thing.
In my view, that's the only thing that makes sense to interpret. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes a farce.
Now, at the same time, as committing himself to 3.5, the finance minister has also announced a committee to review the working of the FRBM Act, specifically to decide whether in future India's target should be a fixed figure or a range. Do you think a range makes better sense in Indian conditions, or do you fear that it could allow fiscal indiscipline to creep in?
Well, I was very pleased to see that particular announcement. You know, I've written one or two places that the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act that we've got is a very flawed act. And first of all, it focuses on the central government's fiscal deficit, whereas actually from a fiscal point of view, it's the central and the state governments that matter. Secondly, we really ought to have a fiscal trajectory that's clearly linked to a debt sustainability analysis. This one isn't. I mean, 3% came from somewhere, and it has just been enshrined then onwards. So the idea of reviewing is a very good one. I'm not sure what you mean by a range. I mean, I think what people have in mind is a flexible kind of targeting where you set a target in terms of what would be called the structurally adjusted fiscal deficit. That means that if for some exogenous reason growth turns out to be much lower than you thought, then you would actually modify the target accordingly.
So do you approve of the idea of a range rather than a fixed figure?
Well, I approve of the idea of setting a framework in which you can have a structurally adjusted deficit, which, if things change in the course of the year, gets modified. But it should be modified in a predetermined way. And a range seems to imply that as long as it's somewhere between A and B, I'm all right. That's not what I have in mind.
Now, this budget was announced at a time when there is particular concern about the reliability and credibility of the way India measures GDP. Do you believe this is an economy that's growing at 7.6, which is the government's latest figure, or do you fear that when you look at the ground, and you look at credit offtake, company profits, company earnings, exports, etc., it's nowhere near 7.6.
Well, I think that's a very legitimate point, and let me say up front, I share the view of many people that it doesn't feel like 7.6%. We should be clear there are two numbers there. First of all, the official numbers. It's 7.6 is the GDP at market prices, which includes taxes, indirect taxes. The GDP at factor cost, which is what people normally think of, is only 7.3. Nevertheless, it is an increase over the previous year, which was about 7.1. But the really surprising thing is that manufacturing in the new numbers is supposed to have gone up from 5.5 in the previous year to 9.5 in the current year. And quite honestly, I find that difficult to accept. Now, the good news is that the Central Statistical Office have set up an official committee to go into these numbers. So they recognize that there's some problem there. And I think they should come out with a report as quickly as possible to settle all these doubts.
Now, the second thing is that this budget was announced at a time when there is particular concern about private investment, about exports and rural distress. Arguably, the finance minister has tackled the rural distress part of it. But do you think he's done enough to kick up private investments and to boost exports?
Well, you know, I'm glad that on the rural distress side, there's some focus, which you say, whether that's going to be enough to settle rural distress is another matter altogether, because you need to do a lot more in agriculture.
Do you have doubts on that score?
I'm not sure what's being done on agriculture, but that's not budget related. See, remember, agriculture is actually a state subject. So the honest truth is that the central budget can do very little on agriculture. I mean, let's take a simple thing like marketing, or take something like extension, or take something like agricultural research. Most of this is done in the state sector. So we have to see what state governments do.
Come back to private investment and exports.
You know, I don't believe that the budget is some kind of a magic wand that can somehow raise exports and raise private. I think we have real problems here which maybe need to be looked at more fully. First, as far as exports are concerned. You know, globally, this is an incredibly unusual year because global trade has pretty much collapsed, not just the oil exports of everybody being down in value terms. Global trade in terms of real production has gone down, volume terms. Second, as far as private investment is concerned, globally also, I mean, private investment is affected by what are the global perceptions of uncertainty. And those are extremely high. Third, many of our top corporates have stressed balance sheets. Now, when you have a stressed balance sheet, you really can't expect to be getting money from the banks very easily. And that is not something the budget can address. That's something that has to be addressed by the banking system, the private sector, the Reserve Bank of India, all taken together. Of course, the finance ministry has to play a big role in that.
So what you're saying is, as far as boosting private investment and boosting exports are concerned, it's not the budget we should look to, it's the other action the government will take over the course of the year.
Yes, I agree with that.
Let's for a moment focus on this question of stressed bank assets. Jayant Sinha has confirmed that the total quantum is as large as 8 lakh crore. But beyond permitting 100% FDI and asset reconstruction companies, do you believe this government and do you believe the budget in particular have taken effective steps to remedy that problem? Or do you think here there's a lot more they should have done which as yet they don't seem to have done?
Well, again, this is, you know, you can't have everything in the budget. So the problem resolution of the stressed assets situation, the recapitalization and the change in management structures to avoid these problems in future, this is not something that can be announced in the budget. But certainly there's a big a roadmap ought to be laid out. I believe they're discussing that right now in various conclaves.
But it's urgent that the roadmap be laid out quickly.
Absolutely. In my view, that, you know, within maybe a couple of months, we should be totally clear. What are we going to do about the stressed assets? What are we going to do about recapitalization? Are we going to recapitalize all the public sector banks so they can all lend an equal amount? Or are we going to recapitalize the ones that have done well so that they can lend more, and the ones that have not done well are held back? I mean, these are lots and lots of issues of detail.
Now, when you say all of this should be clear in a couple of months, you're really suggesting time is not really on the government side. They have to move fast.
Yes, I think this is, first of all, this is not something that's new. This has been known for about a year. And it's one of those issues where simply looking at the problem and reconvening a week later is not going to solve them. There are difficult decisions, and they ought to take them And they can do that. It's not really unusual.
Now, one subject which is very much a part of the budget is fulfilling the promise the finance minister made last year of dropping corporate tax from 30 to 25%. He's taken two small partial steps this year, but they're really limited just to companies with a turnover below 5 crore or brand new companies that come into being after the 1st of April. As someone who understands the complexity of Indian taxation and changing it, in your eyes, are these two good steps constituting a good start, or is it far too little and left too late?
Well, what has been done is actually quite limited. Whether the finance minister felt that he didn't have fiscal room to do more or not, I can't say. But I wish there had been a clearer indication of when are we going to actually get to 25% for everybody, and how and when are the major exemptions going to be removed.
In fact, the truth is that he only has 2 budgets to do it, because no one believes he'll do it in 2019 when an election will be 2 months away from the budget. So with just 2 budgets in hand, do you fear that he may actually not be able to bring everyone down to 25%, and this promise may remain partially unfulfilled?
Well, I wouldn't want to prejudge that, but 2 years is a lot of time if you're very clear what you want to do and you're willing to do it. The problem in all this is you're taking a risk. And I think you can't do any economic reforms without taking risks. So I think the fact is there will be people on one side saying that's going to lose a lot of money, and people on the other side, no, things will be okay. It's the final call, it's a political call. Are you willing to take the risk? And I hope he will be willing to take the risk. I mean, let's be clear about one thing. India's corporate tax is way out of line. And you're working in a global world where people can locate, even Indians can locate their businesses elsewhere. It doesn't make sense to have a corporate tax which is totally uncompetitive and then be talking about making India competitive.
So this is a moment to take his courage in his hands and to show he has the courage of his convictions.
I would certainly say yes.
Now, one of the catchy promises, some people say actual boasts made by the finance minister, was that in 5 years he's going to double farmers' income, which means that on average it has to grow by 15% per year. Most people have turned around and said this is absolutely impossible. On the other hand, the government insists it will do it. Do you believe it's doable?
Well, look, as you said, to double in 5 years is a nominal increase of 14% per year, roughly. I think agriculture in real terms, the probability of agriculture growing much faster than 4% is very low for a large swathe of agriculture, okay? Now, obviously, if inflation is let loose, then 14% a year is perfectly possible. But I'm assuming that you've got an inflation target, which you've set for the Reserve Bank of India, and no price can depart too much from it. So if that inflation target is around 4%, then you're talking about a 10% per year growth over a 5-year period.
Impossible.
Incredibly difficult, certainly. You know, let me say one thing. You can always do it in some model farm where you start off at very low level.
But not nationwide.
Not nationwide.
Now, the finance minister got a lot of flack, both at home and abroad, on television and in the pink papers, for failing to reverse and revoke Pranab Mukherjee's 2012 retrospective tax amendment, popularly known as the Vodafone tax. He said that he's promised he's never going to impose it, but people turn around and say politicians make promises to break them. Now, this was a measure that was passed when you were in government. You've defended it when you were Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. So what I want to ask you is this: was Arun Jaitley right not to reverse it, or has he made a mistake and should he have bitten this bullet and cleared the deck?
Tough one to answer, because when you say I defended it, as you say, I was in government then. And what I remember saying to you is that the mere fact that it's a retrospective amendment is not something that rules it out. All countries do some retrospective amendment. The thing about that particular one, which I think made it the most dubious, is that it was an amendment which tried to overcome a Supreme Court judgment.
Two Supreme Court judgments.
Very regrettable, and it would have been better if it had not been done. Now, whether the minister could actually reverse it or not, or he has some other way of solving the problem through arbitration, this is something he has to decide. It is true that that issue keeps coming back. I don't know how easy it is to convey the seriousness of the intent that we'll never do it again.
One more question about the budget. Many people are intrigued by the announcement that the government will permit 100% FDI in the marketing of food products produced in India. And people wonder whether this is a small backdoor that's opening that might in due course lead to the government looking much more favorably upon 100% FDI in multiple retail. As you know, the government didn't reverse your government's policy on FDI in retail. They've actually allowed it to continue, but they haven't encouraged people to come in. Now, with this new move in terms of FDI in marketing of food products, do you see a backdoor opening for the other?
Well, I wouldn't call it a backdoor opening. It's certainly a rethinking, and certainly a signal which suggests that the earlier move was actually a good one. I'm in favor of allowing foreign investment in this whole area. So if the move works, so much the better.
What about the government's decision to open a small window for the disclosure of undisclosed wealth at terms that are sizably better than last year's black money scheme? Is that a good way of mopping up money at a time when perhaps the government is concerned about resource mobilization? Or is it simply proof that last year's black money scheme was a flop?
Well, I haven't thought enough about that, but let me tell you that historically, most of these one-time windows, etc., do not add up to very much. So I'm not a great believer that this is a way of getting black money back. I mean, the important thing is to prevent black money from being created, not to allow it to go on and then every now and then think that you'll be able to get it back.
Let's now come to an overall view and perspective of the economy. You've had the advantage of sitting back for 21 months and viewing the economy and its handling. First of all, let me ask you, what's your impression of the way the economy will fare over the next 1 year?
Depends almost entirely on a combination of what happens globally and how much we can do internally on our own economic reforms. I mean, we discussed earlier what the growth rate of the economy was, and I said that, you know, the lower number on the official side is 7.3. Most people feel that it doesn't fit in with ground level. It could be lower. But let's remember that even if it's lower, even if it's a little below 7%, it would certainly be a lot better than most other countries. I think people don't seem to realize here that the globe is going through an exceptionally bad time. Look at Brazil, negative 3%, Russia, negative 2.5%, South Africa, little about 1%, China, right down, officially they say, to about 6.3, 6.4, and many people say that's actually even lower than 6.
And Europe is doing badly too.
And Europe is doing badly, and Japan is stuck. Only the United States seems to be sort of perking up a little bit. So it's a very poor global situation. And now, I think that in India, an improvement from our present position through a lot of determined action domestically, particularly in getting infrastructure going, stimulating private investment as much as we can, and essentially maintaining macro balance, not kind of sending the fiscal deficit into a spin, would create an environment where we could do better next year. But you know, we're nowhere near the numbers that are being talked about, like 8% and 10% and so on. Frankly, if we were to do somewhere around 7+ in the coming year and then move up, that would be pretty good. But that requires a lot of hard action in getting some of the reforms going.
Absolutely. You began your answer. Affairs over the next 1 year depends on the global situation. You've explained the global situation. It looks pretty adverse. There's not much we in India can do about it. We're just going to have to adjust to the international circumstances we live within. But now the second factor is getting internal reform going. It looks to most as if GST is not going to happen in this budget session either, and many fear that additionally even things like the bankruptcy bill and the real estate bill may stall because of the differences between the government and opposition and the fact that Parliament as a result doesn't function. Are you worried that if GST stalls, bankruptcy doesn't happen, real estate doesn't happen, that would have a very damaging impact on the economy?
Well, I think if all these things don't happen, it will have certainly a slowing down effect on the economy. I mean, look, the difference between chugging along at maybe 7, maybe a little below 7, and getting up to something into the 7.5 range depends very much on a stimulation of investment in infrastructure and visible progress in reforms. Now, if we get a lot of infrastructure investment, not that much progress in reform, we have a little more time. But you know, I don't see that, I mean, how this is to be done in a democracy. I mean, this is for the government and the opposition to sit down and work out and try to evolve a consensus.
Absolutely. Indian political parties mustn't let the legislative process become dysfunctional to the extent that the economy suffers. They must sort out the differences so that agreed reforms can happen.
Yep.
Let me talk briefly to you about GST. Many would say that the key difference, I know that there are actually three areas of difference between Congress and the government, but the key difference is over this question of whether there should be a cap on GST, and then B, whether the cap should be written into the Constitution. First tell me, do you believe there should be a cap?
Well, having a cap is not a bad idea as a signal that, look, we're not going to kind of go beyond a certain level. But whether you put it in the Constitution or you can put it in the GST bill itself, this is an open matter of choice. I don't know how strongly the political positioning is on this.
Well, Arun Jaitley's position is that a cap in the Constitution means that it's going to be almost impossible to change. And if you have, say, for instance, a flood or a cyclone somewhere and you need to raise money for Tamil Nadu, you're going to have to start changing the Constitution or resort to special levies and cesses, which is not a good idea. On the other hand, Mr. Chidambaram turns around and says it has to be in the Constitution, and he says that if the professional tax cap can be in the Constitution, why can't this? Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I think this is something where we're at an early stage where the two sides are taking positions.
Well, not at an early stage. They've been quarreling over this and delaying the bill for sessions.
Yes, but there are two, it's not very clear to me, by the way, that the other two issues have been resolved. Because if this was the only issue... And
well, Arvind Subramaniam has more or less indicated that the 1% interstate entry tax should be done away with.
Arvind's committee...
And on the dispute resolution mechanism, Mr. Jaitley is willing to implement one of the file notings of Mr. Chidambaram, which is in the initial stage. The Council of States will consider it. But if they can't come to a method of handling it, then they will appoint an expert committee, but it will be non-judicial.
Well, I don't know, for example, how much of this has been actually communicated. Let me say, Subramaniam's committee report, you're absolutely right, this 1% should go, that's clear. I mean, that 1% is really an abomination. The dispute resolution mechanism, perhaps it can be resolved. If the only issue is the cap on the Constitution, on the rate, my personal view is that putting the cap in the Constitution may not be necessary. We don't normally put tax rates on it. For example, you could say the same thing about the income tax. The professions tax is a unique kind of tax because nobody's ever tried to use it to mobilize anything. So I feel that there is a logic to a cap. If it can be done in the GST bill itself so that changing it looks something more substantive, then hopefully they can find some compromise. But I'm not sure, by the way, the other issues have been resolved.
All right. Let's come to probably what I think will be the last issue, maybe even the last question in this interview. What is your assessment of the handling of the economy by Arun Jaitley?
You know, it's a mistake, I think, to think that the finance minister is handling the economy as if he was running a locomotive and all of it is under his control. I mean, I think you can talk about how's the economy done in the course of the last couple of years.
What's your answer to that?
My answer to that is it's quite clear that, I mean, the reversal of the slowdown that happened in the last but 1 year of the UPA had already taken place in the last year of the UPA. So there was a kind of, from 5.4 it went up to 7.3. Then it went up to 6.3. Then it went up to 7.1, and this year we don't know exactly what it's going to be. So it's an economy that's turning around. But you know, having turned around, it's been caught by a global turmoil that nobody actually anticipated. Now, one positive thing about that turmoil is that unlike other countries, we are big beneficiaries of the low oil price. So that should be a huge advantage to us. But on the other hand, we are hurt by uncertainty in the global.
But
in my view, by the way, the important thing is not what happened in the last year or 6 months. There are things on the agenda today. So in my view, the government will be judged by how it handles these. If 6 months down the road there's no progress on any of these, then we've certainly got a problem.
So what you're saying is the real test and challenge for Mr. Jaitley begins now.
Yes.
The things on the agenda today is what he has to handle and handle correctly, and
yes.
if he doesn't, he will be then considered to have mishandled the situation.
Well, he will have missed an amazing opportunity because as the government approaches the last 2 years, then it normally runs out of options.
So this is an opportunity he mustn't miss.
Absolutely correct.
This is in a sense a moment of test for him.
If you want to put it that way, yes.
Very quickly, Do you think he's capable of the job? Some people fear he's not a natural-born economist.
I don't think you need to be a natural-born economist to be a finance minister. As I said earlier, he has the best possible advice he can get. He can get other advice. The key thing is the government has to take some risks. Whatever it does, whether it's in the area of bank, how do you fix the banks, how do you do the restructuring of assets, what do you do in political management, there is an element of political entrepreneurship and political risk.
In other
That's
words,
what you really need.
Bite the bullet. You have no option but to do so.
That would be a good way of putting it.
Fiscal Ahluwalia, a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks, Karan.